To the glory of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Mark 13 is the most difficult chapter in the whole gospel, and one of the most difficult chapters in the whole of the New Testament that also has parallels in Luke 21 and Matthew 24. The chapter begins with the disciples admiring the great temple buildings from a distance, and Jesus announcing that those impressive buildings will all be destroyed. And it ends with Jesus giving a warning about his return in glory. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. Today's gospel reading from the middle of Mark 13 involves a warning about the abomination of desolation, a time of intense tribulation or suffering, and the appearance of false messiahs. Now, this is the kind of biblical text that we're inclined to pass over because it seems either too difficult to understand or because we think that it may simply be irrelevant to us. Now, bearing in mind that no one sermon could adequately deal with this text, I want to ask a question and then try and answer it. So the question I'm going to ask here is, what is the good news here? What is the good news in today's gospel reading? Before we can answer that question, we need to get our bearings. In Mark 13:14, Jesus gives us a point of orientation by mentioning this thing called the abomination of desolation, which is actually a reference to Daniel 12:11 in our Old Testament reading this morning. And Daniel 12:11 actually refers to a specific historical event. On December the 15th, 167 BC, the Greek ruler of Egypt and Palestine, Antiochus IV, put a pagan altar in the temple in Jerusalem and thus desecrated the temple, making Jewish worship there impossible. Jesus now uses this phrase, the abomination of desolation, to refer to another historical event, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple under a Roman army under the command of the general Titus in AD 70. So our first point of orientation is what many would have regarded as the greatest catastrophe imaginable: the destruction of the holy city of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, God's visible dwelling place in this world, by a pagan army. And the destruction was complete. By the time the Roman army pierced the walls of Jerusalem, Titus ordered his soldiers to leave no one alive in the city, and many of the residents of Jerusalem died by crucifixion. It's hard, I think, for us to imagine what this might have meant. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and seeing the news, however you get it, and learning that overnight, Washington, D.C., New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Atlanta had all been completely destroyed in a nuclear attack. Jesus wants his listeners, and also us, to think about our worst fears. And then he challenges us not to allow those fears to cause us to lose hope. Our second point of orientation is not a historical event, but a trans-historical event. The event is hinted at in Mark 13:20 and then made explicit in Mark 13:26. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. It's a reference to Daniel 7:13 And it's important to note here that clouds don't mean the figure is coming down out of the sky, because clouds here are a reference to the divine glory. That is, whoever this figure is, he is the visible appearance of the glory of God. Jesus actually refers to Daniel 7:13 again in Mark 14:62 at his trial. Under questioning by the high priest, when the high priest says, okay, tell us, yes or no, are you the Messiah? Jesus replies, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Jesus is then condemned as a blasphemer for making himself equal with God. So in between this great catastrophe and in between Jesus' return in glory, there is great suffering and tribulation, and there's division and confusion in the church. Now, I think I know what you're thinking at this point. Okay, I feel a little less confused, but didn't you say that you were going to talk to us about good news, and I haven't heard any good news yet? Okay, well, just be patient. The good news is coming. Let's think about what Jesus is doing in Mark 13. I think that one of the problems that we have in reading the Bible is we often expect it to simply add to what we already know, or we expect it to confirm what we already think. And in Mark 13, Jesus is not trying to add to what we already know, and he's not trying to confirm what we already think. He's trying to change the way that we look at the world. At one level, Jesus is addressing our tendency to respond to difficulty and suffering by asking the question why God would allow these to happen. And when we do that, we usually tend to make at least one of two false assumptions. False assumption number one is, if God's doing his job properly, there shouldn't be disasters or sufferings, and so if there are, God must have somehow failed. False assumption number two, disasters and suffering are something that indicates that something's gone wrong with God's providence, because God's providence should mean that what happens is what we want to happen all the time. Both those are false. Now, I think that all of us have had at least one of those thoughts in our minds, even though we might not have been willing to admit it to ourselves. In the case of each, all it takes is a moment's thought to show that they're wrong. The reason why Jesus wants us to think about both our deepest fears and his return in glory is because he wants us to see that until his return in glory, we have no true perspective on any disaster or on any suffering at all. It's not that Jesus simply offers us comfort in the midst of suffering or disaster. It is that he and he alone provides us with the true perspective on the life of the world, the life of the church, and our lives. Jesus is wanting us to see one of our two spiritual flaws. We constantly want to understand and make sense of the difficulties and sufferings that befall us apart from his return in glory. That is, what we really want to do is we want to write a review of the movie even before seeing the end. If we want to make sense of the disorder and confusion in the church, and if we want to make sense of the suffering and difficulties in our own lives by ourselves, we will inevitably misunderstand them. And we will inevitably come to the wrong conclusions. And those conclusions will undermine faith, hope, and love. That if so long as we insist on writing premature reviews of the movie that we have not fully seen yet, we will fail to see what the movie is really about. And we will decide that the director of the movie is either incompetent or just bad. Luke 21 parallels Mark 13, and in Luke's version, the good news stands out more clearly than in Mark. As Jesus describes the suffering and difficulty of the church and the world, this is what he says. Now, when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. The good news is this, that Jesus himself is the end of human history. And because all things find their consummation and fulfillment in him, all disasters and all sufferings can only be made sense after his return in glory and not before. And because that's the case, even in the midst of difficulty and suffering, we can straighten up and raise our heads because we know that our redemption is drawing near. Now, I know all this sounds very counterintuitive, and I've had to remind myself of this week. Over this past week, we've made arrangements for 3 funerals in this parish and have dealt with other pastoral difficulties and other problems. And the temptation is to get bogged down in all of that stuff. When I find myself doing that, I like to go to 2 Corinthians 4, where Paul tells us the good news. So we do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Straighten up, raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Amen.